بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذرياته ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك ثم أما بعد. So alhamdulillah, this is the third session of 3 or 4 bi'Iznillah of the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. We have already covered in the past 2 sessions some of the Meccan period, dealing with the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and we spoke a little bit about his life before prophethood and some of the events and the conditions in the Arabian Peninsula prior to the arrival of the prophethood of Muhammad ﷺ, and also some of the early adopters of Islam that included his wife Khadija radiallahu anha and his closest friend Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and those members who lived within his household such as Ali ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu anhum ajma'een. So the Meccan period was roughly 13 years long, and I'm not sure we talked about this last time, but the year that the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed away, Abu Talib, and then shortly thereafter his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, was called Aam, or is known as Aam al-Huzn, or the year of sadness, and it culminated in the Prophet ﷺ traveling to a northern mountainous city known as Ta'if, where he went to invite the people of Thaqif, the tribe of Thaqif, to Islam. And that was a difficult day. He brought Zayd ibn Haritha with him, and he went from person to person, and none of them really had time to listen to what the Prophet ﷺ was saying. And so he left, and in fact, even the small children of the streets chased him out of Ta'if and threw rocks at him, so forth, as he was leaving. And then he retreated to the garden area, which belonged to 2 sons of Quraysh chieftain, Utbah. And there is when he met Addas. And Addas was a Christian, but he was a servant and slave of that Utbah household. And it was there that he was offered some grapes and some fruit to eat, and they got into a conversation, and the Prophet ﷺ asked Addas where he was from, and he mentioned the town of Najran, which is the same town as the Prophet Yunus ibn Matta, Jonah, the one who was in the whale. And then it was that at that point Addas realized that this man was not just any ordinary man, this was the Prophet, or the Prophet that he may have read about that the peninsula was expecting. So he fell down on his knees and started kissing the Prophet ﷺ and realizing that he was a prophet. So even in the middle of this shiddah, even in the middle of this severity and these difficulties that the Prophet ﷺ was going through, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still ennobled him. So even though he was seeking the tribe of Bani Thaqif, right, which were a prominent tribe, and had they come around, they would have been very useful allies for the Prophet ﷺ in dealing with his own troubles with Quraysh, his own tribe. But they did not come around. In fact, they were one of the most intransigent tribes that there were, and they kind of came into Islam even later on. But nevertheless, the Prophet ﷺ received this young boy, this young man, who more or less proclaimed his Islam right there in the garden, Addas, and even though he was seeking something, Allah gave him something else. And we can take a lesson from this, in that sometimes we're looking for the big victories, or what we deem to be the big victories, what we think is the way that things should be going, the proper route, and so forth. And I put this much effort in. You know, in the societies that we live in now, it's kind of somewhat mechanical about how, you know, there's a level of expectation. If I put in a particular amount of effort, then I usually expect a particular result. So I put A, B, C, then 1, 2, 3 should happen. But if we study the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ closely, we see that rarely did A, B, C lead to 1, 2, 3. And in fact, that was a victory for the Prophet ﷺ. That Addas came to Islam and he was given even what we consider to be a small victory, but in fact, in terms of its ma'na, in terms of its meaning, it was a large victory for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. How do we know that? Well, it was just a few months later that the Prophet ﷺ was ennobled in a way that no other human being has ever been ennobled before or ever will be after. And that namely is the night of Al-Isra and the Ma'raj, or the night of Ascension. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I want to get to the Madinah period. But that was a night where the Prophet ﷺ, as we all know, ascended first to Jerusalem, Bayt al-Maqdis, and he led all of the prophets and messengers who had ever lived before him in prayer on that area where the masjid is now. And then he ascended to heaven on the back of the he went to Jerusalem on the back of the Buraq, and then he ascended to heaven, going through the 7 heavens and meeting various prophets. And then finally, when the prayer was made obligatory and he had this conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where first the prayers were 50 in number, and then they were reduced finally to 5 when Moses alayhi salam told the Prophet that his ummah would not be able to do more. So on that night, the Prophet ﷺ had some type of communication, direct communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the majority of ulama also say that the Prophet ﷺ saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How he saw him in what capacity exactly is not known and cannot be known in this life. But nevertheless, there was a type of ru'ya. There was a type of vision that the Prophet ﷺ saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is reserved for every other single human being in the world, whoever exists, for the next life. But the Prophet ﷺ was given a glimpse of that even in this life as an ennoblement to him. So we might say, subhanAllah, that's like, what can beat that? What can be more? And we know that the greatest pleasure anyone can aspire to in heaven is to gaze upon Allah's countenance, in whatever way that means. We only know it when we get there, inshallah. So why did the Prophet ﷺ still have all these difficulties afterwards? Right, because after he came back, as soon as he returned to Mecca, right, because when he left, he was sleeping in the Kaaba, and then when he came back, it was as if only moments had passed. He was actually physically gone, moments, but all of that transpired during that time. So when he came back, of course, everyone said that this is some type of far-fetched story, and how is it possible to have happened? And in fact, many of the Muslims had a hard time accepting it, and some of them actually even thought about leaving Islam if they didn't actually leave Islam as a result. And so they tested the Prophet ﷺ. He was immediately tested as soon as he went back to Mecca, even after that great ennoblement. And there's a lesson in that for us, in that even when we achieve a particular type of victory, a spiritual victory or a victory of belief or faith or iman, whatever you might want to call it, that doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not continue to test us. And in fact, it's a victory in of itself when you recognize that the test itself, that too is a victory, in a sense. When you start seeing that even the testing, the way that you are tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a type of ata. It's a type of Allah bestowing His favors upon us, even when He tests us. And you might say that sounds a little bit, at the very least counterintuitive. How can I be tested? How can I have difficulty in my life and Allah is actually favoring me? How is that possible? And Allah favors us in different ways. And when Allah seeks good of His servant or wants good for him, as mentioned in one of the hadith of Bukhari, مَنْ يُرِدْ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ, that when Allah seeks good of a servant, He gives him fiqh of the deen. And fiqh here doesn't mean knowing how to pray and fast and zakah. That's a later terminology that came about a few centuries later. But fiqh here means understanding of the deen. And deen means كَمَا تَدِينُ تُدَانُ. Deen means how you deal with others and how others deal with you. And the most important one that you have to deal with is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here understanding in deen is understanding in how Allah deals with you, and in return, how you should deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you have that understanding, then you know that the mihan, the tests that come your way, the difficulties, That's deen. And if you truly understand it, then you understand it's a favoring, it's a bestowal upon you, right? It's not a chastisement, it's not a punishment, it's not ihana, right? Allah is not debasing you, He is ennobling you. You know, the so-called fall of Adam, alayhi salam, and in popular culture, that's considered a fall, but for us, Adam was ennobled. It wasn't a fall. Allah wasn't debasing him when He took him out of heaven or paradise and put him on the earth. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ennobling him. How do we know that? Because Allah, before He took Adam out of paradise, He told the angels, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, I will put upon the earth a steward who will be my representative on earth. And so that was an ennoblement even before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew about what would transpire with the tree or the forbidden fruit in paradise. So in the same vein, we will see that the things that happen to us in our life, there will be times where we will feel ennobled, rather obviously, and then other times we'll start to question and say, well, what does Allah want with me with this particular test that I'm going through? Is it a type of ennoblement? Am I being debased? Am I being reminded? Is Allah trying to show me something? Perhaps. But the more understanding that you have, the more fiqh of the deen, which means understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the more you'll be able to recognize when these things happen, and then you'll actually say, Alhamdulillah, and mean it. Right? When someone asks you, how's it going? You say, Alhamdulillah, I got a D on my final. But none of you will get Ds, inshallah. I know this is finals week for people who go to Drexel here, and I appreciate that you came out even though you have a lot of studying to do and all that type of thing. But Jazakallah khair. So after the Prophet ﷺ, after the Isra and Mi'raj, and then he went back to Mecca, it had been that the Prophet ﷺ now had been in Mecca about 11 years or so. And one of the things that he used to do, Mecca still was known for the Hajj. And even prior to the Hajj regaining its original form, when the Prophet Ibrahim brought it about, because now the Hajj was more about a grand marketplace, and people showing their wares, and people reciting poetry, and people making sacrifices to idols. That's what the Hajj became about during those years. So still people of the Arabian Peninsula, every year they would come during the Hajj season and they would make pilgrimage to the Kaaba. And these were all different various tribes from throughout the Arabian Peninsula. So this was an opportunity that the Prophet ﷺ did not fail to seize to invite these different tribes to Islam as they would come and make pilgrimage. And most of the time, he would not have a favorable response. And one of the reasons for that is that Quraysh knew what he was doing. So they would tell the people coming, like, don't listen to this man. He's left us. He's saying crazy things. It's magic. There's a sorcerer who put a spell on him. And, all this sort of slandering and misinformation about what Islam really is, which sounds familiar, right? Don't we all have to deal with that sometimes? People are slandering us and misinformation and saying all these things about what we are and what we aren't and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ went through a very similar thing when people came from different parts of the peninsula and he had to deal with these issues. So it was not until a particular group had come one of these years, and they were from a land or an area or a city called Yathrib. So the people of Yathrib had come, and there was about 12 of them. And they came, and they had heard about this Prophet ﷺ, and they had expressed an interest in Islam. And they even went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, we want to express our Islam to you, and we want to do it in a way that gives you an indication that we're serious. And so the Prophet ﷺ accepted this, and they met at a place called Aqaba, which is close to nowadays where the Aqaba in Mina, where the people throw the stones at the Jamarat. There's an area close to there. In fact, they uncovered the mosque a few years ago that was built in that area. I had the fortune of visiting it, which is very close to the Jamarat in Mina. So they met at this place called Aqaba, and this is where the Bay'at al-Aqaba al-Ula. So the first bay'ah, the first oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ was pronounced by some members of the Yathrib community, and there were two major tribes, Al-Aws wal-Khazraj, and the Khazraj being more than the Aws. So these 12 people, 12 men, gave this bay'ah to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And the bay'ah consisted more or less of saying that they will not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they will not steal, that they will not kill their children, and that they will deal with people equitably and fairly. And sometimes this bay'ah is called bay'at al-nisa. Sometimes it's called the oath of allegiance of the women, because it did not include in it an oath to defend, even physically, the Prophet ﷺ if need be, which the women did not have to do in general, because it happened the next year as well. But in this initial one, the first Aqaba, they did not include that part. So sometimes it's referred to as Bay'at al-Nisa. So this was in the 11th year after the Ba'atha, 11th year after the initial prophethood, the Ghar Hira, for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these 12 people came and they left, and these were 12 new Muslims, but they weren't going to stay in Mecca because they couldn't, so they went back. So one could say, well, the Prophet told them what they needed to know, they go back and they can just handle things themselves, but that's not what the Prophet ﷺ did. These were new Muslims, they needed attention, they needed someone to teach them, they needed care, they needed someone to follow up. They didn't just need someone for them to come to the front of the majlis and say their shahada and everyone says Allahu Akbar and then nobody hears about them after that. But rather, the Prophet ﷺ took care of them and he sent with them one of his own companions. That companion was Mus'ab ibn Umayr. So Mus'ab ibn Umayr radiallahu anhu was sent back with the 12 when they went back to Yathrib, which would later become Al-Madinah. It was not known as Al-Madinah yet. And Mus'ab ibn Umayr was one of the Sahaba who lived what you could say a very privileged life in Mecca. He was one of the wealthier Sahabi. His family was wealthy. He had the finest clothing. But when he accepted Islam, his mother did not accept his acceptance. And she more or less cut him off from everything. And so instead of the fine fabrics that he used to wear, now he was wearing rough, coarse clothing, and he barely had enough to even cover his nakedness. But he did that for the service of the Prophet ﷺ, for the service of Allah, and for the service of the deen. So he went back with them that 12th year. Then a year transpires, and at the same time the persecution that was happening in Mecca was increasing. So even despite the fact that some of the major companions who had a lot of clout with Quraysh, like Umar, like Hamza, radiallahu anhum, but still those people who did not have a strong sub-tribe to protect them were being persecuted, and some people were even martyred, like the family of Yasir ibn Ammar, Ala Yasir. So this continued, but then the next Hajj, the following year, which was the 12th year, the one before was 11th, now we're in the 12th year, a larger group came. And this group numbered about 73 men and a handful of women, maybe 2-3 women that came with them. So a much larger group. So what had transpired during that year is that this Islam that they had initially understood from the year before, with the help of course of Mus'ab ibn Umayr, now had spread so much that there were dozens of people who had accepted Islam. And they were just representatives. There were still more people back in Yathrib who had also accepted Islam. And it's not clear from the sources how many people or the percentage of Yathrib that actually became Muslim, but one can deem that it was a large amount because the tide started turning, especially for that society. So what is it about this place Yathrib that made it so conducive to people accepting Islam? What made it different from Ta'if? Right? These are Arab tribes here, these are Arab tribes there. How is it that they were more accepting? Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted it that the hijrah would be to Medina and not to Ta'if. So He designated that as the mahjar of the Prophet ﷺ. But there were also reasons behind it that Allah obviously put in place. One of those reasons is that in addition to the two Arab tribes, there were three Jewish tribes living in Al-Madinah or Yathrib, which made it a unique place. Because you didn't have anywhere in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula where there were Jewish tribes besides Yathrib. There were at the periphery, in the north, for example, where Syria begins about, that there were Jewish tribes or Jews living in those areas, but Jewish tribes were not Arabs living in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula was kind of unheard of. And one of the things about these three Jewish tribes, Bani Nadir, Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Qurayza, is that they were monotheists. They were obviously Jews. They were not polytheists. And in fact, they started the da'wah, to be honest with you, in a way. So initially, the people of Yathrib got their da'wah from the Jews and not from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. At least the da'wah of monotheism, or at least the da'wah of believing in one God. And not only that, but they also heard from these same Jewish tribes that there will be a prophet appearing in this place. So the Jews had access to their scripture that said, not just anywhere, but Yathrib. Whatever name it was known by in their scripture, most likely in Hebrew, was the place that was designated in their scripture, and that's why they were there to begin with. Why did the Jewish tribes go to Medina? What made them go there? Yathrib was not exactly a very wealthy place to be. They made their living by date palms and some animal husbandry. So it wasn't a very wealthy place. Mecca was better off in terms, because the Meccans were traders. And so, not just traders, but they also had the pilgrimage. So if you wanted to go and make money, especially if you're a trader, you don't go to Medina, you go to Mecca. But they didn't go to Mecca. They went to Yathrib, because it was in their scripture that the Prophet would be appearing in this place. Now, of course, the assumption of the Jews was that he would be one of them. He would be someone from one of those Jewish tribes, not from the Arab tribes. And in fact, they would say to the Aus and Khazraj, the two Arab tribes that were there, that just wait until the Prophet comes and all of this shirk that you're doing and this, worshipping idols and putting sacrifices to the idols, all that's going to go away once this Prophet comes and he'll show you and so forth. So they started hearing this message initially from those same tribes that later were to oppose the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So it was a more conducive environment. So in the 12th year, this large group came, and now this bay'ah was not just like bay'at al-nisa. This bay'ah also, or this oath, was also to protect the Prophet ﷺ, and if need be, in a physical manner. And so now there was a shift, or a shift started to begin here, and there was a realization that that the passivity that was happening in the earlier years was about to change. Now, the Muslims were not given the permission to defend themselves yet from the Quran, but by virtue of the fact that this oath was different in character, different in nature, then this was clearly indicated that it was about to happen. So when this bay'ah happened, they obviously did it secretly. And when they did so, they went to a secret place and they would try to hide, so no one would see them. But nevertheless, the next morning, Quraysh had found out that they did this, that this group of 70 people came from this sister city of Yathrib, of Medina, not to be known as Medina, Yathrib, and they had given bay'ah to the Prophet, or an oath to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and it was also an oath to defend, and militarily or physically, if need be. So now, this was, what they say, paradigm shift. So for Quraysh, this, what do they say now, the kids? They say, stuff just got serious. Is that what you said, right? Huh?
Just got real.
Got real, yeah. Stuff started getting real for them now. Because before, you know, they're part of our group. We can kind of manipulate them. We're ready to, you know, we can keep them down. But now stuff started getting real when these people from Yathrib came, and you know, they got like a place there. They actually have husun, forts, because Yathrib is set up different than Mecca. Mecca was, you have a central area, which is the Kaaba, and then surrounding Mecca are houses and homes. Medina was different. Medina was like a fortress city. So each tribe sort of had a fortress that was surrounding them. That's why when the Prophet ﷺ went to Khaybar, which was the fortress of the Jews, they were actually fortresses. And he had to lay siege for weeks to get in there because it was difficult because they were fortified. So that's real. That's not playing around anymore. So when the Prophet ﷺ and when the Quraysh learned of this got their attention, and in a big way. So it got their attention in a big way. Most of them had already left, the 70 or so. Two had kind of struggled behind. One of them was one of the leaders of one of the Nuqaba, one of the lieutenants of the 70, and his name was Mosaad ibn Ubadah, and he was captured by Quraysh. So they captured him, they brought him back to Mecca, and they actually started to torture him, persecute him, beat him, because of this agreement or this oath he had entered into with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And someone came up, and while this was happening, he said, "Don't you have someone here that has given you protection already?" This protection is called ijara. And ijara means that if you are without a tribe, and this was a system of tribalism that was going on in the peninsula at the time, if you're without a tribe and you want to enter a city, right, and you're not family with anyone in there, none of them is your tribe, then you have to seek ijara, which is someone giving you sort of a visa, so to speak. So they're giving you, and this could be anyone, it could be any tribe member, any tribes person, can give you this temporary visa for you to come, and then you're under their guise and under their protection. So they said to him, "Didn't someone give you that before?" And he mentioned a name, and then so that person came out and he said, "I give him protection." And so they let him go. And this was the system. So even though we think of it as jahiliyyah and a little bit of tribal savagery, but they had certain customs that they used to follow. And in fact, during the time the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, he had a type of ijara which was furnished by Abu Talib, his uncle. And even when Abu Talib died, there were other Meccans who also provided this for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So he was able to leave, but the secret was out. Now that the secret was out, the persecution increased even more. So we're in the 12th year, and we're just months away from the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so the wahi came, the revelation came at this point, that Allah gave the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ permission to give to the Sahaba, the companions, the Muhajirin, who weren't Muhajirin yet, they didn't leave yet, but they were to leave, permission to leave and go to Yathrib, to go to Madinah. And so the first person to leave was Abu Salama, and he was the husband of the future wife of the Prophet ﷺ, because he died, and then the Prophet ﷺ married her, Salama, who is one of our mothers of the believers. But he was one of the first to go. And others trickled thereafter. And they didn't all leave in a big group, because they had to leave secretively. Everyone left secretively. Everyone left in the middle of the night, and they left with barely the clothes on their back. They couldn't take anything with them. If they did, then they would be seen, and then they would be known, and they would try to be stopped. So everyone left secretively, except one person did not leave secretively. You can probably all guess who that was, right? Who do you think? Umar, of course. So Umar ibn Khattab, he was not doing it secretively. So what he did, he went to the Kaaba, he made tawaf, he prayed 2 rak'ahs behind the maqam of Ibrahim, and then he stood in the center and he made an announcement to Quraysh, and he said something along the lines of, whoever wants their mother to have a dead son, or they want to make their children orphans, or they want to make their wives widows, I'm about to leave, and they could meet me behind the valley over here. That's exactly what he said. So they were all like, okay, we're not doing that. So he left, and he did it that way. No one else did it like that. But that was Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab, al-Faruq, الذي يفرق بين الحق والباطل, right? He was the divider, the one who divides between truth and falsehood. So he did it in this way. So others left until there was no one left in Mecca except a few people. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the children of Abu Bakr, Asma and Abdullah, and his father, who had not accepted Islam yet anyway, and the Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Last ones left. Obviously Quraysh, they realized this. They're like, where's everybody go? Everybody's gone. And they realized that there was only a few left, and one of those people being the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it was also part of their tribal custom to have a sort of council meeting. And they had established this place from the days of their forefather, Qusay ibn Kilab, who was one of the Quraysh forefathers, 5-6 generations before that. This place was called Dar al-Nadwa, the place of convening. So they convened all of the nobles of Quraysh, including Abu Sufyan, Abu Lahab, Abu Jahl. These people came together, and Walead ibn Mughira, and they said, what are we going to do? So one of them, they came up with some ideas. One of them said, we can exile him. I said, isn't that what he's doing already? That's not going to help. We can trap him, imprison him. No, they'll come back for him. They'll have him escape. We can, try to convince him again. Well, that didn't work already. So all of these ideas, no one was accepting. Till this man they never seen before came in. And he had sort of the clothing and the style of the people from the interior of the peninsula. So this central area of the peninsula was called Najd. So he came in the clothing of a Najdi Shaykh. Shaykh, yani an old person or a notable. And he came in and he said, all of these ideas are wrong. So someone else mentioned another idea, or it might have been him, he mentioned it, or someone else. And they said that, well, you can kill him. They said, but if we do that, then we will not be able to fight Banu Hashim, because the way that the tribalism worked, if you kill someone of their tribe, they come after you and then the war lasts for 100 years. They don't want that. They said, no, do it in a way where each tribe will pick the strongest shab, young man of their tribe, and they will strike him with multiple blows, but like one blow. So no one can tell who was the actual, who put the final blow that kills him. And in that way, Quraysh will not be able, or the Banu Hashim, the sub-tribe of Quraysh, will not be able to decide who to seek vengeance from, and they will not be able to defeat all of us. And then the Najdi Shaykh said, هذا هو الرأي. This is the good opinion, this is the idea. And so Ashab Seerah ibn Hisham, they mentioned later on that person was not really a person. He was shaitan, in the guise of a person, which the jinn, which is a shaitan, is one of them. They have the ability to take on the form of other creatures, including human beings. So he came in that form and he left. And they were left with this idea, that they would do this. Prophet ﷺ was informed of this hideous plan by Jibreel alayhi salam, and so he knew it was coming. So he instructed Sayyidina Ali, as we know, to sleep in his place, and he also instructed Sayyidina Ali to stay behind so that he may give people back their valuables. See the hypocrisy. They trusted him the most. In fact, they put their valuables with him, but they wouldn't trust him with the wahi, with the revelation. But the material goods, they still knew that the Prophet ﷺ was the most trustworthy, because he was known as Muhammad al-Amin, Muhammad the trustworthy one. They still kept it with him, even when they were fighting him and opposing him. And so the Prophet ﷺ could have said, they're trying to fight us, let's just take it with us. But Prophet ﷺ was عَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. He is the one who has the greatest character. And it's not becoming of someone of his stature to be machinating in that way, plotting and taking things that don't belong to him. So he instructed Ali to stay behind to disperse them. And at the same time, as a ruse, that he would sleep in his bed in his stead. And the Prophet ﷺ then went to the house. Asma bint Abi Bakr describes it, or Aisha, and she said, one day the Prophet, during this time, the Prophet ﷺ, someone came knocking on the door, and it was the Prophet ﷺ, and he was wearing a covering, like a mask. So that, and this was during the middle of the day. She said, he came at a time we're not used to him coming over. And then he told Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, do you have a rahila? Do you have a rahila? Rahila means you have a traveling camel. From rihla, because not all camels are the same. Though a traveling camel, the one that can take you, on a 2-week journey, which is how long it took to go from Mecca to Medina, that's not just any camel. That has to be like the long haul camel, like the Dodge Caravan or something. The one that's going to take you, not the camel that just for daily trips, but the long haul camel. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he had always hoped that he would be the one to make the hijrah to Prophet ﷺ. So he was busy preparing 2 of these animals, 2 of these long haul camels that would make that trip. And so the Prophet ﷺ asked them, are they ready? So we realized that the Prophet ﷺ was ready to leave, and that the one accompanying him would be Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anhu. So Ali slept in the bed, and we know the story that happened. The Prophet ﷺ had not had enough time to leave yet, and so he threw the dust on them, and all of them were blinded. He exited, and then they went in to find Sayyidina Ali. But at that time, the Prophet ﷺ already left. So what he did next, though, is interesting, in that Medina is located north of Mecca. Prophet ﷺ traveled south, to Ghar Thawr, which is south of where he is positioned. So he did this to throw them off the track. He knew that they were going to be looking for him, so they traveled to Thawr, and they stayed there for 3 days and 3 nights. And during this time, Asma bint Abi Bakr, her role, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, radiallahu anhu, was to prepare the food, and she had like this waist belt that she wore, and she tore half of it to tie the food in. And after that, she was known as Dhul Natiqayn, the one of the 2 strands, because she used it to tie the food. So she would walk every day back and forth to bring them the food. The other child of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Abdullah, his job was to hang around Quraysh and hear what they were saying. What they were thinking about. Were they going to go after him? Were they going to try to head north? Are they going to assemble an army? Whatever the case may be. So sort of to get the news, in a way, spy on the Quraysh and see what they were saying. Then there was a third person, part of the plan. This is an elaborate plan. Because the Qurayshis know how to track, and if you walk in the sand, you leave prints. You leave footprints. You leave, they know that who was there and who was walking and so forth, and they could figure out how many people, how many animals were with them. So a servant of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he took his flock of sheep, and every day he would walk back and forth on the tracks so as to hide that there were 2 people walking back and forth every day. All of this elaborate plan. And so they retired to the Ghar, to the cave in Ghar Thawr, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq went in first to make sure that there was no snakes or scorpions or something to bite the Prophet ﷺ, and then they sat there. Nevertheless, despite all of this elaborate plan, we know that Quraysh caught up with them. And they were able to track them anyway, and they tracked them right to the mouth of the cave. To the degree that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq remarked, he said that all they had to do was look down and they would see us. What did the Prophet ﷺ say to him? He said, what is your idea when there are 2 people here and the third one is Allah? So even though the Prophet ﷺ did all of this elaborate plan, and you might say from the idea of all the steps that he took, the plan failed, because they were found anyway, at least at this point. That it should have been a point where they would have said, all right, what did it say? The gig is up, right? The gig is up. But the gig wasn't up, right? Quite the opposite. Prophet ﷺ had the utmost confidence. He said, what do you think the third one is with us is with Allah, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so they didn't look down, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused the miracle to happen. And that the spider spun its web, and the birds made their nest, so that they would have never thought anyone had one in there, because this looked like it had been there for months. So they stopped just short of the mouth of the cave and they left. And they did not go inside. So that was a close call, but that wasn't the only close call that the Prophet ﷺ had. So once they left, then they got on their way. They had hired a guide who was actually not Muslim, he was still a mushrik, but he had agreed to guide Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ towards Medina from a less well-traveled route. There were caravan routes, obviously, between the two places that were well known, but those would be the first places they would look. So they took a coastal route, a route that goes by the Red Sea, which is further out because Medina is more inland than Mecca. But nevertheless, they took this coastal route in order to avoid detection. They did this, and one of the scouts had sighted two people from another tribe. And this was mentioned to a person by the name of Seerah. And Seerah, he said, describe them to me, and they were described. He knew it was the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr. But then he told the person who saw them, he said, no, that's not them. That's this person and that person. They're going on a trip. Why did he do that? Because Quraysh had put a bounty on both of their heads. 100 camels each. 100 camels each back then is like 100 camels now. Probably a camel today is like a good one, $2,000 or $3,000. So that's $200,000 or $300,000 on each of their heads, which is still a considerable amount of money. So Seerah is thinking, I got $500,000 here to myself if I can capture them, both of them by myself. So he sat down on his horse. He had a horse. And they were in view. He saw them. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq felt him and he looked behind and he sees Seerah gaining ground. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't turn back once. He didn't turn back his head. The same thing that happened in Ghar Thawr. Until every time Seerah got close, the front hooves of the horse would go into the sand and he couldn't continue. Happened once, happened twice, happened 3 times. At this point, Seerah said, you know what, this is bigger than me. So he cried out to them and he said, I give you aman, I give you safety, I promise not to hurt you, I just want to talk to you. So they stopped, turned around, and they spoke. And the Prophet ﷺ gave him the aman, and he struck a deal with him, and Seerah promised not to let anyone know that he had seen them. And then the Prophet ﷺ promised him something too. He said there will be a day later on when Islam will come to Kisra, which is the Persian Empire. That's like us saying today, if we're in some faraway land and we said, you guys know what the crown jewels are, right? In England? Yes, please. Crown jewels. It's like the most valuable thing that's kept in a big Tower London type of thing. So someone out in some faraway land and said, yeah, one day you're going to get the crown jewels of the Queen. You'd be like, what are you talking about? That's, we're just a band of bandits here and we're nothing. Those people don't even think about us. They're a superpower. We're not even on their radar, which was the case. The Persian Empire was one of the 2 superpowers at the time, in addition to the Byzantine Empire. They ruled the world, more or less. Persian Empire to the east, and the Byzantine Empire to Europe and the north and the west. So he said, one day, when we get the gold or the crown jewels of Kisra, you will wear it. So he accepted that, and he actually gave him some type of thing to hold with him, so that when that day came, that he would be able to do it. And it was years later, during the Khilafah of Umar, anhu, that this came to be. And Seerah went to Umar and he said, I went to the Prophet and he promised me these things. So Umar, he had to do it. He gave it to him and he wore it. And then he gave it back. He said, I just wanted to fulfill the promise of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So they continued on their way, the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and they made their way undetected, more or less, until they got to a border town before Medina known as Qiba or Quba. Both pronunciations are valid. Those of you who have visited Medina, it's one of the mazarat, one of the areas that are usually visited. And it was where the first prayer or Jum'ah was prayed in Qiba before they reached Yathrib. And they spent a night or a day there, and then they made their way to Al-Medina, to Yathrib. And the people of Yathrib knew the Prophet ﷺ was coming. So every morning, from sunrise all the way to Dhuhr time, which is the time usually the caravans would arrive, they all waited to see him come out. And they did this for days, waiting for him, anticipating his arrival, until he actually arrived, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then this is where we know that they were burst into song and even into dance, and they sang Tala al-Badru alayna, and everyone wanted to be the one to host the Prophet ﷺ in their house. Everyone, of course, who wouldn't want that? And the whole town came out. SubhanAllah, this whole place, this town of Yathrib, all became Muslim, and the Prophet ﷺ had yet to set foot there. So they knew him by what they heard about him, not even meeting him in person. But nevertheless, they had this longing, this desire, this shawq to meet with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So when this happened, they all wanted to host him. And Prophet ﷺ realized, of course, the situation. He couldn't really choose anyone, because then it would be something that, could be a fitna, strife. So he told them, "Da'aha فإنها مأمورة." Leave the camel, the rahila, because it is one being commanded, and it will show me where to go. So it started walking via the line of houses there, and it stopped at a place that was used as an area where they would dry the dates. Remember, the industry in Medina was date palm growing. And so people had fresh dates, and then they would also dry the dates. And so this was an area used for that. It was owned by 2 orphans. And so it stopped there, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "This is where I will stay." Across the street was the house of Abi Ayyub al-Ansari, one of the people of Medina and one of the great Sahaba. So the masjid was to be built at that spot, and also where the Prophet ﷺ would live, but in the meantime, he stayed with Abi Ayyub al-Ansari across the street. Abi Ayyub had a duplex, 2 floors. So initially he told the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ wanted the bottom floor. But Abi Ayyub tried that, and then he got so nervous because he didn't want to walk anywhere where his feet would be on top of the head of the Prophet ﷺ. So they would walk actually around the periphery of the room. They wouldn't walk in the middle of the room, so they're walking around the walls like this all day, him and his wife, because they didn't want to walk in the middle, to be standing over the head of the Prophet ﷺ. And they would send down the food to the Prophet ﷺ. And when the plate came back up and it was finished, they would look to see where the hands of the Prophet ﷺ was, and they would touch it, seeking barakah. This is the words, this is in Bukhari. I'm not bringing from anywhere that's a source. Right in Bukhari and Muslim, this hadith is narrated. They would touch the plate, seeking the barakah of the Prophet ﷺ. One time they sent something with garlic and onions in it. And so the plate came back up and he didn't eat from it. Or at least he didn't eat the part where the garlic and onions were. And they got very excited and nervous, Abu Ayyub and his wife. They said, what did we do? Why didn't he eat from it? What went wrong? So forth. So they went downstairs and they asked, and they said, no, I don't have a problem with garlic and onions, وَلَكِنْ أَنَا أُنَاجِي رَبِّي. But I have my munajah, my conversation, my time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I can't have been eating garlic or onions for that, because of the smell that comes out. So even the Prophet ﷺ was realizing this, and he's dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so after a while, Abi Ayyub could not take being on the top floor anymore, and he insisted that the Prophet ﷺ take the top floor, and so he relented, and they switched. But this is a man who had never met the Prophet ﷺ before. He didn't know him. He didn't have the fortune of seeing him, spending time with him, sitting with him. But from the da'wah of Mus'ab ibn Umayr, and then the Sahaba that made Hijrah, obviously, and from the 73 original Medinians from Bayat al-Aqaba, Thaniya and al-Ula, they went there, and this knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ now came to fruition when his actual person went there. So there's many lessons in what we just talked about. But one of them, I think, that's important is that when we speak about following the Quran and the Sunnah, Because we hear that a lot. You should be a good Muslim, you should be obedient, you should follow the Sunnah. Obedience is important. But obedience will carry little meaning if there is not a strong motivator behind it. Right? Because why do you be obedient? Why do you do that? What's the point? What makes you do that? And we see here with these initial companions that it was love. It was mahabbah. There's no other way you can describe it. No other way you can describe people who were so happy to see the Prophet ﷺ that they broke into song and dance. No other way to describe that Abi Ayyub was so careful in what he served the Prophet ﷺ and even touching and seeking the barakah of where his hands had been. And then the Sahaba later on, when the Prophet ﷺ would make wudu, that water that dripped from his limbs, they would all vie with one another to capture some of it, to drink it, because of their love for the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, aqarrahum, he gave his approval. He didn't say that what you're doing is wrong. He said what you're doing is right. So love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, love of the Prophet ﷺ is actually the motivator. It's more important than the obedience. So obedience to them is a fruit. It's a thamara. It's something that comes out of it. So if you only obey God and obey His Prophet because you feel like you have to, and there's not a love of doing so behind it, you're going to burn out. It's not sustainable. Right? You will never do anything for a long period of time. It's not going to be sustainable unless you love doing it. And we've probably all tried that in our life. Right? We've tried different things, and someone was telling me they switched majors and things like that because he didn't love, or she didn't love the first major, so they tried another one because it wasn't sustainable because they didn't like it. So it's only going to be sustainable if we cultivate that love. We seek to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet. And you can't say, well, I didn't see him, I don't know him. Abu Ayyub loved the Prophet ﷺ before he even saw him. And he knew the Prophet ﷺ from the people who were around him. He knew him from Mosaad ibn Umayr. He knew him from the other companions that were there. He had this knowledge of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the key is to love him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you love the Prophet, then you have to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you love both of them, then you have to love all the ones that they love too. So that includes all of the companions, the people of the household, and the people of obedience, and those who love them. So it all goes back to Habba. And the Prophet ﷺ, his nickname was Al-Habib. Just like the nickname of Ibrahim was Al-Khalil, the friend of Allah. And the nickname of Moses was Kalimullah, the one that God spoke to. And the nickname of Jesus alayhi salam was Ruhullah, the Spirit of God. But the nickname of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the beloved of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just a couple of points I wanted to talk about before we break for maybe some question and answer if people are interested. So after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam arrived and he stayed with Abu Ayyub, and then they began one of the first things he did. There's three major things he did in the very beginning on his arrival. And the name Yathrib to Al-Madinah gives us an indication of what those three things were. Because in Medina in Arabic just means city. It's kind of like, putting the in front of it, alif lam makes it the city, the city. In other words, this is the city. This is the city you should try to emulate. This is the city that you should hold in high esteem and regard. This is the city that leaves a blueprint for all future cities that come after it. And there's an implication here that we are social creatures by nature, human beings. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't establish a monastery in the mountains, which he could have done, right? Could have made like a convent type of environment, far away from the Quraysh and far away from all the warring tribes and far away from all their nonsense. He didn't do that. He went to the heart of the matter. He established a community in this place called Yathrib, and then it was such a lofty community that it took on the name of the community, the city, Al-Madinah, Al-Munawwara, the enlightened city. right? And we know that a city literally doesn't get enlightened. We're not talking about street lights, right? We're talking about the inhabitants of that city and the way that city, that community is made up. And in Medina, min al-tamaddun. And tamaddun means civil partnerships, civil relationships, fellow man with fellow man. So one of the first things, he did three major things I'm going to talk about. One of the first things he did, obviously, was he built the masjid. And the masjid was built on that area where we mentioned the camel, his rahila, his long haul camel had stopped. And it was owned by two orphans. He didn't take it as a gift. He paid for it, paid 10 dinars, 10 gold coins, which is kind of a significant amount of money that he paid for that. And then it actually had some old grave sites and it had some stuff that had to be cleared out, which they did, and then they built it. So the masjid originally was, they describe it as about 100 feet dhira, which dhira is like less than a yard, more than a foot. So 100 by 100. Not that big, probably as big as this room, along those lines. And it was not, it was made of palm tree bark. They didn't have really a roof. They used some of the palm tree bark to cover part of the roof. And they built it from the style of Medina, which was the mud bricks that they built everything else from. And there was no carpeting, there was no marble, there was no tile, there was no minaret. The initial masjid just was very simple, and it was still sand and rock inside. So very much the same grounding that you find outside of the masjid, you will find inside the masjid. But it was the first thing that he established. And he established the 5 daily prayers in that masjid. And there was a practice of the people of Medina to pray all of them together, the 5 daily prayers together. And even some people who lived a little further out, and what I mean by a little further out, maybe like a kilometer or two walk, a mile or two walk, a little further out, and some of them asked permission not to pray there, and the Prophet ﷺ did not grant them the permission to pray there, to pray somewhere else. He said, come and pray in the masjid here. And so establishing that early on, right, because people say, well, I understand it's important to pray in the masjid and it's better than praying alone, but why? One of the reasons is you cannot establish a community, a real community, if everybody's in their house and we only get together on occasion, or we only get together when there is something that's not, something of a maslahah, something of a personal interest. We get together, I need to buy something from you, buy something from me. But when people get together, all together in lines, lining up, all facing in the same direction, and initially the Qibla was not towards Mecca, but towards Bayt al-Maqdis, towards Jerusalem. And they all lined together, praying in that direction, praying under one Lord for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This started to make the important binds of that community, the cohesion that needed to happen to really be called a community. So a community doesn't mean just a bunch of people living together. Community actually means with all of those meanings in there, therein understood. So he built the al-mujtama', he built that society, he built that community, and one of the first building blocks of that community is the space. So establishing the sacred space, right? So it wasn't somebody's house, like in Mecca, Dar al-Arqam, that was temporary, because they didn't have the ability to actually meet them, for example, in Mecca, in the Kaaba, and meet there and pray there. But this was different. Now they had the ability to establish this mujtama', to establish this community, and so they meet in this newly built masjid. But the Prophet ﷺ didn't stop there. The second major thing he did, not long after, or very close after, something called al-akha, or al-ikha, to make bonds of brotherhood between the muhajirin and the ansar, between the immigrants and those who were indigenous to Medina. And so he paired up people. And to the extent he paired them in brotherhood that they would, even upon death, they would inherit from one another. So it wasn't just a type of bonding that was like, you guys go have coffee together and, if he needs a ride somewhere, give it to him. No, these were even bonds that were made as strong as or stronger than bonds of blood. So when you inherit from someone upon their death, then this is the closest type of bonding, familiar relationship that you can have with someone. And the Prophet ﷺ established this in the beginning. This ruling later on was abrogated, became mansukh when there's no longer a need for it, when the bonds had already been well established, and the Prophet ﷺ didn't have to do by this type of enforcement. But initially, this was the understanding. And not only were the thing about inheritance, but even houses were split up, wealth was split up. Even one of the Medinians, he said, I have more than one wife, I'll divorce one for you and you can marry her. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he said, he was the muhajir, he said, may Allah bless you in your wealth and bless you in your family. Show me where the market is. He was a trader. The Meccans are traders. So they said, show me where the market is and I'll take care of these things myself. And the hospitality of Ahl al-Medina is praised in the Quran. الَّذِينَ يُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. Right? Those who prefer over others over themselves, even if they don't have the ability to do so. And they were renowned for what they did. One of them, for example, he had this relationship from one of the muhajirin, but he was of small means, and it said that this ayah came talking about him. And so one night he didn't have enough to feed himself, his wife, and his guest, the person from Mecca. So he told his wife, shut off they didn't have electric lights, but he told her, turn off the siraj, the lamp that gives light, and make it dark, and put bowls in front of us, but empty, and a bowl in front of our guest, and it's full, and we'll pretend to eat. And we have nothing to eat. They didn't have dinner that night, because all they had was enough for one. But at the same time, they didn't want their guests to know that. And so they made it like they were eating with him, even though there was nothing for them to eat. And you think, how can people be like that? How come someone to that level of, they don't even know them. They're a completely different tribe. They don't know who they are. They came out of nowhere. Can you imagine that someone come into your house tonight and said, if I told you this person is your brother for life and you have to give them a space and you have to give them food and clothing and take care of them. But they did it willingly and happily. Why? Because it came from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this gives us an idea of when we talk about ukhuwah and brotherhood in Islam, I think we just know very little about it. Right? Ukhuwah in Islam is not your Facebook friend list. Right? Ukhuwah means someone that, not even if you just prefer them over yourself, but even if you go out of your way for them, you're willing to be inconvenienced for them. How many of us are not willing to be inconvenienced by anybody? Right? We want to have our thing when we want to have it. We want to have our routine. We don't really want to go out of our way. Oh, this person needs a ride. Well, can't you take the bus? It's kind of easier. And that's, I'd have to make that U-turn up on Market Street. I don't really want to do that at this time. No. But they gave everything. The Muhajirin gave everything up. Like I said, they came with the clothes on their backs. They had nothing. And the Ansar gave whatever they had. That's why they were called the Ansar. Right? Because from al-Nusra, from giving help, giving victory, giving aid to those who were closest to them. But this left also the idea, the problem, or not the problem, but the issue of, well, there were people in Medina who were still not yet Muslim. There were some, not all of the Arab tribes became Muslim, the vast majority. Some of them kind of pretended to be Muslim, the idea of munafiqeen, hypocrites, which we'll get to later in the next session. But then there were the three Jewish tribes who did not accept Islam for the most part. So the third major step that the Prophet ﷺ did was that they wrote up this thing called al-wathiqa, which means document, to document things. So internally, he had al-ikha, he had this bonds of brotherhood between the Muhajirin and the Ansar. But externally, to a group that had not entered into Islam, namely the three Jewish tribes, he made a wathiqa. In other words, it's usually, they call it the Constitution of Medina, which is the closest thing that you can probably translate it as. So this Dastur, this Constitution, outlined not just the relationship for even the inhabitants, like the Ansar and the Muhajirin, but also their relationship with the three Jewish tribes, external relationships. And in it, you'll find things that deal with like social justice. You find issues of social welfare. If someone falls into a debt, then that person should not be left to cover their debt by themselves, and it's a responsibility of the rest of the place, the rest of the city, to help him pay off that debt. That sounds like welfare to me, and that's what, 1400 years ago, before Europe, for example, after World War II, they thought the idea, well, let's do welfare so that we don't leave people starving on the streets. But the Prophet ﷺ instituted these type of bonds and these type of apparatus and institutions to build that ideal community. And what I mean by ideal is not perfect, right? Because even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were people who transgressed, people who made mistakes. But he set up the structures that would thereby ensure the sustainability of this community. And not in a physical sense, but even in emotional, spiritual, mental, all types of aspects for it to continue. So establishing the close bonds therein, the social bonding, and also what we would call social bridging, which would be relationships with other communities, external communities. One of the problems we have today is that many Muslim groups, whether they want to call themselves a group or a jama'ah or whatever, sometimes movement, is that they do establish these social bonds, and you'll find that they're very tight-knit. But if that is not tempered with bridging to people outside of the group, if it's not tempered with that, then inevitably, or more often than not, it will lead to a type of extremism. Extremism in the sense that now they will only see the people that only really count as someone within the group. But those external to the group are of a lesser value or of a lesser caliber, and in a sense, less human. And this is a problem that is plaguing the ummah today, that we've divided ourselves into many jama'at, many groups, and if you're in the group, sometimes, wow, this is good, this feels nice, they got my back, that type of thing. But when you see how these groups deal with people outside of it, so now the allegiance becomes to the group, and they fail to bridge, and they fail to recognize the importance of those even who are not in their particular group. And this happened early on in the ummah, but when the Prophet ﷺ was at the head, right, and there was this ta'leef, وَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِهِمْ, he brought warring tribes together that hitherto never had these type of relationships. They never thought that they could come together. And the Quran describes them as شَفَى حُفْرَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ, on the verge of entering to a pit in hellfire, was the degree of severity and the degree of intransigence between these warring tribes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِهِمْ, He made this ta'leef. You know, He made the hearts inclined towards one another to the extent, and this was unprecedented in the Arabian Peninsula, that someone like these Ansar would give up everything they have, or most of what they have, to support this group that came and more or less had to share their resources with them, which to begin with were limited. They were not wealthy people, the people of Yathrib, and they were not even that educated as compared to the Meccans. Most of them didn't know how to read or write. And that was the reason why after the Battle of Badr, which we'll get into next week, or next time we meet, that the Prophet ﷺ made the ransom of one of the Qurashis who was captured to teach 10 people of Madinah to read and write, because it was not something that was common between them as it was more common in Mecca. So despite all of these differences, nevertheless, they made themselves completely available for the Muhajirin. So Islam is not just about personal piety. It's not about just you and your Lord. That's a big part of it. But if the relationship between you and your Lord doesn't reflect itself in how you deal with others, then you don't have a good relationship with your Lord. You can't have a good relationship with God and at the same time you don't get along with anyone else. You are the type of person that people run away from. They can't stand you. That's not what's meant. In fact, it should be the opposite. The most beloved, the most praised one, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, had the best relationship with his Lord, and he is, by virtue of his name, he is the most praised one. By virtue of his name, he is the beloved, Habibullah, and he is the beloved of billions of people worldwide. Before we came into our existence, in previous history, and even until now. And he is the one whose name is constantly being mentioned As Allah had promised him in the Quran, وَرَفَعْنَا لَكَ ذِكْرَكَ, and we have raised you in remembrance. So that means one of the signs of you having a good relationship with your Lord is you have a good relationship with people. And even though despite the difficulties that would come later on with these three Jewish tribes, Prophet ﷺ in the beginning gave them the benefit of the doubt and he established them as full citizens of the Madinah community, in as much as the Muslims were citizens. He didn't discriminate against them. He gave them their full rights. He said they are to practice their religion as they please. They are to marry as they please. They do not own the Muslims anything. So unless that social bonding is tempered by an absorption of other ways of thinking, other ways of doing things, right? And at the same time, being able to see that these other groups are a responsibility upon you. To maintain good relationships with them is a responsibility and not a burden, then it's very easy for these things to go awry rather quickly. So I think I will stop here, inshallah, and we will continue. We have one more session left, and we will get to hopefully some of the events that came later on, and which will culminate in the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and what happened thereafter.